Hey Wargamers, the Tau Index is just days away, and so I figured we'd have a little fun and make some predictions about what Crisis Suits will look like in 10th edition. Now, the reason why we're talking about Crisis Suits is because they are kind of the iconic Tau unit. They are one of the first things you think about when you think of Tau, and they are a very important element of the Tau army, particularly because they're a mobile chassis that delivers diverse and powerful weapons. They have really complicated loadouts that allow them to have a tailored role in your army. They can be anti-troop, they can be anti-vehicle, they can be anywhere in between and do a whole lot of heavy lifting for you. And their native abilities, whether that's jump, shoot, jump, or shooting in combat, or some other thing, those things have on their own made Crisis Suits a very powerful tool, but also has facilitated some extremely synergistic effects with other characters, particularly Tau commanders. Whether we're talking about older editions or newer editions, Tau commanders have done a whole lot to make a already good unit in the Crisis Suit be amazing and at times broken. So that has made the Crisis Suit just a beloved unit and one worth spending some thought about how they're going to look in the index. However, the things that make Crisis Suits great, namely their complexity, their ability to be tailored, all those kind of granular elements of the Crisis Suit also make them a target for Games Workshop in their mission of simplified but not simple, right? They are looking at Crisis Suits undoubtedly as something that may be too overcomplicated to fit within this simplified but simple mantra, and so it will need to be streamlined in some way. That's going to involve looking at the weapon loadouts, looking at the support systems, looking at their native abilities, and how they interact with other units, again, specifically commanders. So all four of those elements are likely to be addressed in the index in some way. If we look at what Games Workshop has done with other factions that we have rules for already, we see a few trends emerge. One is that, for the most part, every faction has undergone some form of streamlining or having their war gear condensed down into fewer options, right? So whether we're talking about the melee weapons of Tyranid warriors or the heirloom weapons of Space Marines, those all get condensed down to a single option, whereas they used to be multiple different things. Now they are just one. So for the Tyranids, right, we're looking at scything talons, we're looking at lash whips, we're looking at bone swords. Those all, as far as rules are concerned, mean the same thing, though they don't have a different set of rules for each of those different choices. And so just because a kit has different bits, different options for how you can build them, does not mean that it will have different rules. And this is a pretty big divergence from what Games Workshop has been doing over the past few editions, which is coming up with more and more bespoke rules for specific bits, right? So if we're thinking about Crisis Suits, right, they have been building more and more support systems in order to make those things mean something, make those choices that you make in building the kit mean something. And so they are definitely going back on that a pretty sizable extent. Additionally, unit abilities are distinct, but not unique, right? They're repeated across factions. We see several different similar or identical abilities show up across different factions. Sometimes these abilities are maintaining the theme or the functionality of old war gear, or to introduce some sort of more thematic element to the unit, right? Doing something that they didn't really have rules to do before, but really made more sense for how you envision them in your mind. But we're looking at things like rerolls or extra movement. Those types of abilities, those native abilities, have shown up time and time again in the indices that we already have. Some of them are unique, but not all of them. So Games Workshop is certainly willing to reuse rules in different factions. And then finally, we see that stat lines are only modestly altered. For the most part, most units have stat lines that are fairly similar to what they were in 9th edition, with the exception of things that are at the larger end of the spectrum. So larger, chunkier units like monsters, vehicles, those things tend to be pulled out a little bit further along the number line, going back to kindergarten here, right? they're being pulled out to have larger values. And so outside of those big units, those big scary things, we're seeing some pretty modest changes, a point here, a point there in terms of strength or toughness or, AP or wounds or whatever, right? They're just minor variations, which when you scale it up across the whole game can add up to be a lot. But if we're looking at every unit in isolation, they're relatively minor. And so with that in mind, I think it's pretty reasonable that Crisis Suits will have a mostly unchanged stat line in the index. This gets some support from the Manta preview, where it was talking about the maximum number of wounds on battle suits that it could carry in its transport capacity. But so we're probably looking at Crisis Suits staying at 5. Maybe they go to 6 wounds, something like that, but probably not 7 or 8, anything, on the larger end of the spectrum there. Staying where they're at seems probably about where we're looking at. And given some of the changes to weapons in terms of AP and damage output, maybe that is still relatively stronger than where they were at. Of course, there is still the loss of drones, and so taking on the whole, they're still more vulnerable. But if we're looking just at the Crisis Suit itself, staying at 5 wounds might not be necessarily a downgrade. I think their profile probably is going to stay, around 10 inches of movement, still hitting on 4s. I know you always wanted to see the 3-up battlesuit, but I think it's going to be hitting on 4s from now until the day the sun explodes. And I'm sticking to that. Where I think we're going to see more changes in the weapon profiles, particularly reductions in AP. So plasma rifle probably going to go down to AP -3, maybe AP -2, although I think the lower the AP value goes here, the more overlap you have between some of these different weapons, which maybe isn't bad, depending on how weapon selection works. I also wouldn't be surprised if plasma rifles see either a reduction in damage or an increase in number of shots, or both. Cyclic ion blasters, we are almost certain that they'll be at -1 natively instead of at the -2. And then airburst fragmentation projectors are probably going to drop down to AP0 is my guess there as well. Potentially most important, I'm assuming that all of the standard weapons from the Crisis Suit will lose the assault keyword, that they will just be bland weapons, right? They won't have keywords with the exception of things like AFP, which will have indirect fire, or cyclic ion blaster, which will have hazardous, right? For the most part, they're just not going to have any type of special keyword or anything, which on the face of things would mean that Crisis Suits are more limited in their mobility, right? They cannot advance and shoot with their weapons, and so they cannot move as much as they would with the assault keyword if this pans out. I also think that there's going to be a greatly simplified way that loadouts are created, the way that weapons are selected, that support systems are selected. I think that's going to be extremely streamlined compared to the current version, right? Crisis Suits right now, very powerful, have been since their codex has been released, and Games Workshop is looking to tune them down likely. And so the loadouts is going to be simplified. That combined with the other changes that they're making to Crisis Suits are likely to make Crisis Suits still strong, but not as strong as they have been in 9th edition. So one of the ways that I think they're going to do that is by limiting weapon choices to just what is in the box contents. And this is something that I thought would happen in 9th edition as well, and I was very pleasantly surprised. I liked the system that they came up with in 9th edition of increasing cost per duplicate weapon. I thought that was a very complicated but elegant way of dealing with this problem, because it did introduce some pretty strong incentives that affected weapon choice. But I think that complicated but elegant system is kind of the polar opposite of simplified but not simple. So I would assume that they're going to lose the increasing incremental cost of weapons instead go with a more rudimentary way of selecting your loadouts. So I think they're going to limit to what's in the box, and I think they're going to say, you can pick 3 of the following options with no duplicates. So you can take a burst cannon, plasma rifle, fusion blaster, missile pod, flamer, or shield generator as your hard points, right? You can pick up to 3 of those. I think they're going to lose access to the airburst fragmentation projector and the cyclic ion blaster for Crisis Suits specifically. Maybe that's something that we'll see in bodyguards as a way of making bodyguards more attractive or distinct from standard crisis suits. But I would think that that would be something that is going away, and something for the most part is going to be limited to commanders. Support systems, I think, are going to be condensed into one. This is one place where there was a lot of variability, right? And all of those different pieces of war gear all had, pretty chunky rules, right? You had to know a little bit about what each one of them did in order to assess. That'd be a lot of rules to put on one data card. So if we're looking at, kind of just the space economy of data cards now, it seems really unlikely that they're going to have as many support system options as they once did. So if that's true, then I kind of think that all the support systems, multi-tracker, target link, early warning override, you name it, gets condensed down just to a support system, right? And maybe it's called support system, maybe it's called something else, but some generic support system ability that gives crisis suits some, pretty powerful thing, right? But it's only going to be one of them, and it's going to be fixed. So maybe it's that it allows them to shoot in combat. Maybe that's where this comes up. Or maybe their support system allows them to ignore modifiers, right? Like including cover, but also things for like ignoring the penalty for split firing for the greater good. That would be awesome, right? If crisis suits have that ability, that would be really useful on its own right. Or maybe it's something people have been asking for a very long time. And that thing is jump, shoot, jump. And I think this is probably the most controversial prediction I'm making here. I'm thinking that jump, shoot, jump returns. Now, if you haven't been with Tau for a while, you might not know what jump, shoot, jump is. Jump, shoot, jump is just the ability to move again after firing a weapon. So this was something that made Tau very polarizing when they were first introduced in the early 2000s, was that they could move, shoot, and then move again and, move out of line of sight, for example. And I think now that makes return, but in a more limited context. So I think crisis suits will have jump, shoot, jump either as an ability or something granted to them by that support system, right? So, in reality, those things don't really mean different things, but maybe jump, shoot, jump takes up that kind of fourth hard point, or maybe it doesn't, is really what makes a difference there. And the reason why I think jump, shoot, jump is coming back is for a couple things. One is that we've seen jump, shoot, jump show up on other data cards. So like Tyranid Gargoyles have jump, shoot, jump. They can move after firing. So why not the unit that is really known for doing that? Why not them too? This also addresses the durability issue associated with losing drones, right? If drones are not inherently providing ablative wounds anymore because they're not models, then crisis suits need a durability buff. Otherwise, they are extremely vulnerable. It's not like they are super durable with drones even, but certainly without drones, they are at a hard spot. And so giving them jump, shoot, jump helps address the durability issue, not by making them more durable, right? So not making them more resistant to damage, but making them more likely to avoid the damage in the first place. And restricting it to crisis suits and not all battle suits makes it a more reasonable thing. The way that jump, shoot, jump used to work was like, your whole army could almost do it. Anything with a jetpack could do it. But if this is something specific for crisis suits, it's much more restricted, and it doesn't have as much of a sway on things because it's only a select few units. Maybe it's just one unit. Maybe you only have one crisis suit unit. Maybe you have 2 or 3. But still, you're not having an entire army that's doing this. So having jump, shoot, jump does do a lot to resolve the durability issue. And it's something that, honestly, I was really thinking we would see in 9th edition. If you go back to my 9th edition prediction video, I said that, or rather, how to fix Tau in 9th edition. I said that I thought giving jump, shoot, jump just to crisis suits would be a good way of addressing some of the issues, and I still think that's true. And so either I think we'll see jump, shoot, jump as the support system ability or just as an ability that you get in addition to some other support system ability. If jump, shoot, jump is native to Crisis, then I think they will lose the ability to shoot in combat. So I think it's one or the other. I don't think they can jump, shoot, jump and shoot in combat. I think that's probably too good and probably too many rules for one unit based on how they would have to write that and, again, the space economy of the data card. So I think it's either one or the other. Again, Jump Shoot Jump helps avoid combat, not resist it, and also has some nice perks for grabbing objectives and just positioning as well. It does delay contesting objectives though, right? So you can move on to an objective if it's open, but if you need to get onto an objective and push someone off of it, having Jump Shoot Jump doesn't necessarily help you with that, right? Because unlike shooting in combat, moving again doesn't remove models, right? So shooting in combat does allow them to be a little bit more feisty on the objective, whereas Jump Shoot Jump gives them a little bit more of a cagey playstyle. So those two things are, again, different, and it'll be interesting to see how those two options manifest in the new index. And so those are some pretty big changes for crisis suits, right? We've introduced a couple different trade-offs, talking about Jump Shoot Jump versus shooting combat, talking about movement versus assault keywords on their weapons, talking about the profiles themselves and the complexity of support systems, right? Those are a whole bunch of different trade-offs that we have in conceptualizing the functionality of crisis suits in 10th edition. And so I think some of those trade-offs can be mitigated by commanders. Commanders in 9th edition did a wonderful job of adding flavor, adding functionality, adding a certain je ne sais quoi to crisis suits, and I really hope that that continues forward. I hope that commanders continue to give kind of these characteristic buffs to units based on the suit that they have. And so perhaps crisis commanders will reintroduce shooting combat, right? That maintains some of the access to this really powerful functionality, but makes it limited to a single unit, right? Restricting it to fewer units based on their leader does seem like a good way of doing that, as opposed to making it all battle suits. Again, if Games Workshop perceives the ability to shoot in combat as kind of a too powerful thing or some level of complexity that they don't want to introduce, maybe having it just be something associated with the leader makes more sense. It does seem like, again, an alternative to Jump Shoot Jump though, so perhaps it will be different in manifestation here and more useful to different battlesuit units. So not something that you would really use for crisis suits, but use for your broadsides or your stealth teams or something else, right? Depending on who crisis commanders can join. Maybe crisis commanders can only join crisis suits. That wouldn't be surprising. But if not, then having the ability to shoot in combat might be more useful in some of those other units. Things like the Enforcer, I'm hoping increases your OC value by 1, or maybe more. That'd be cool if it was more, but that's very similar to its current role of increasing the number of bodies for objective control purposes. So affecting the objective control characteristic for a crisis unit seems very reasonable for the Enforcer. The Cold Star, I think, is where some of the options get a little bit more wild. We could look at something like having all weapons counting as assault if they're joined by a Cold Star. That seems like an intuitive thing, allowing them to be, again, more mobile with the Cold Star than they would be otherwise, increasing their mobility or their movement indirectly by facilitating continued functionality despite additional movement. Or maybe if Jump Shoot Jump is a native to crisis suits, maybe this is how they get it with the Cold Star. Maybe the Cold Star gives them Jump Shoot Jump. Again, that would be even more restricted just to a unit that's led by a Cold Star as opposed to all crisis suits. So maybe that, again, is some of the calculus that Games Workshop is utilizing here. But it would work with multiple unit types. It wouldn't have to be restricted just to crisis suits then if the Cold Star can join multiple different units. So that would be pretty cool. Also, I would assume that the Cold Star, more so than the crisis suit or the Enforcer suit, would be a lone operative, meaning that it can't be targeted unless it's the closest thing within 12 inches or so. So yeah, something like that. I would think that the Cold Star would have that lone operative keyword functionality, and so would be able to do more of the thing that everybody wants to do with a Cold Star, which is run it up the board and have it go do its own thing and then die. So having the lone operative ability would be really useful for the Cold Star. I think that's more of a wish list item, though. I think that's probably pretty unlikely, given that the Cold Star is a crisis suit variant and not a stealth suit variant. So those are my predictions for the index that comes out again Thursday this week, we're assuming. So I'm very excited to see what's in it. Of course, I will be going over it as soon as possible and sharing my thoughts with you. So make sure to keep your eye on the internet and on the channel for that. As always, thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Did I go totally off into left field? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let's have a conversation about it. And as always, happy wargaming. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you want to pick up one of the Invasive Wargaming models before they become unavailable, head on over to the Invasive Wargaming Etsy store in the description below. Also, if you like this video, you should know that it is made possible by my kind sponsor, the Magnet Baron, as well as the excellent folks over on Patreon. If you want to support the channel, you can certainly hop on over there and join our community. Special thanks to Shifty, Durza, Everett Keller, Stephen Cowan, Jack Inacker, Jared Egler, and Scott Heater.